If you think back to when you first started studying tournament poker, it's likely that one of the first pieces of advice you were given was never limp pre-flop, only raise. For a long time, we've all accepted that this was good advice. But is that really true? In this video, we'll answer that question. Before we dive into the topic, please do take the time to like this video and subscribe to our channel. It helps us to keep bringing you the content you like here on YouTube. Hi Wizards, I'm Matt Hunt, and if you've ever been wondering about whether it's a good idea to sometimes limp in tournaments, this video is for you, because we're going to be exploring the idea of pre-flop limping strategies in MTTs. By limping, of course, we mean just calling the big blind instead of raising. The primary challenge of this topic is that it's actually quite difficult to investigate the value of pre-flop limping strategies. Let's talk about why that's the case. The first problem is that adding the option for players to limp pre-flop has an exponential effect on the size of any pre-flop game tree, which makes it difficult to examine limping strategies using pre-flop solvers like Hold'em Resources Calculator. Limped pots have higher SPRs than single-raise pots, even at shallow stacks, and the big blind's checking range versus a limp is always extremely wide, so it's hard to find any kind of limp scenario that allows for easy and simple solving. In addition, it's not even very easy to simplify the spot by limiting multi-way action in the way we often do with single-raise pot scenarios, because this would end up forcing players not to limp in situations where a real human player would almost certainly have some kind of a limping range. For example, when completing the small blind and getting an extremely good price. Another problem is that in a chip EV calculation, the EVs of limping and raising will often be quite close together in any sim that isn't run to a high degree of accuracy, meaning a lot of sims will end up with a fair amount of mixing between limping and raising. This isn't a problem in itself, but it does mean that any pre-flop sim involving limping takes a long time to run, even if you can get around the initial problem of an extremely large game tree. It can easily take several days to run a high-resolution sim for a complex, deep-stacked spot with limps allowed, even if your computer is relatively powerful. So with all of this in mind, and accepting that it's a little tricky to test limping strategies without a lot of solving power, it's a very good thing that the GTO Wizard archive does indeed have a lot of solving power. We do have some solutions in the MTT library which allow us to examine actual pre-flop limping ranges, so we'll make use of those in a moment where necessary. But first, let's answer one of the most important questions for this topic. When should we actually consider limping in a tournament scenario? Well, the first part of the answer is rather simple, and it might be somewhat predictable as well. We should almost always have a limping range when it folds around to us in the small blind. If you've watched my previous video about blind versus blind play in MTTs, you'll have seen this graphic on the right here, which shows that at virtually every stack size above 7 big blinds, limping is the foundation of our strategy in unopened small blind spots. This is simply because we're getting a very good price to call and realize equity, while if we tried to play a pure raise or fold approach instead, we might either be folding too many hands pre-flop altogether, or leaving ourselves very vulnerable against aggression from the big blind in the form of 3-bets. So the bottom line here is that you should almost always have a limping range in the small blind when it folds around. The only exception is if you're extremely shallow, or potentially if there are some significant ICM concerns and perhaps you have a big enough stack to apply massive pressure to the big blind by raising. The second instance in which we should almost always have some kind of limping range is when we're playing heads up at the end of a tournament. All our heads up ranges from 6 big blinds all the way up to 60 big blinds feature lots of pre-flop limping, for the simple reason that a lot of our edge in a heads up spot comes from being able to play pots in position at a higher SPR against a weak range. And so we don't often want to adopt a raise-only strategy unless we're really deep stacked. This is especially true in live MTTs where a big blind ante is present. We're getting 5-to-1 to limp the button, so we really shouldn't fold any hand pre-flop in those spots. Splitting our ranges between limps and raises can be very difficult, but unless your opponent is making a lot of mistakes, it's hard to get away with not having any limps at all. Take a look here at some of our heads-up ranges to see what I mean. So this right here is our 60 big blind MTT heads-up solution. And as you can see, we're limping quite a bit here. We're limping about 36% of the time. And it's often going to be with a lot of the weakest hands. You can see that the bottom portion of the deck here is favoring a limp. But there's also a certain amount of trapping going on up here with the very top, and a lot of suited hands that are favoring limping at a decent frequency as well. So really a very mixed approach, which kind of makes sense given that we're fairly deep stacked and we don't want to have a range that's leaning too far in one direction or another. If we scale the stacks down a little bit and we go to the 30 big blind sims, we can see that the limping option is now becoming even more prevalent at about 52% of the time. Again, same sort of region of hands are wanting to limp. There's a lot of suited stuff favoring limping going on over here. A little bit more of this stuff is coming in as well. So definitely some slight shifts in how the range is actually being constructed, but you can see that at 30 bigs, limping is still pretty prevalent, and we've actually gotten to the point where it's become more of a frequency than the 2 big blind open. If we go all the way down to 15 big blinds, now we're getting pretty shallow, and we're getting to the stage where limping is very much the majority of our strategy. We're not in a position where we're really getting a particularly good price to just jam, but we're also not getting ourselves into a great spot if we just min raise and get jammed on. So limping is a very favorable option here. Again, a lot of suited hands, a lot of the weakest offsuit hands, and then some trappy stuff in the top corner here. Finally, if we go all the way down to about 7 big blinds, we can actually see that we are indeed still limping some, even at 7 big blinds deep. We're just playing a limp or shove strategy, and we're doing a lot of trapping with some of our strongest stuff, and then also limping a very weak kind of portion here that is mostly limp folding. So kind of a polarized limping range almost, and a middle strength or a condensed kind of a jamming range. So that's a brief snapshot here of these heads up ranges. But as you can see, limping is a pretty prevalent part of heads up play. And of course, this is not even accounting for a big blind ante. This is only with a very small ante in the pot. So if you are playing live tournaments and you have a big blind ante in play, you can imagine the ranges would get a lot wider. Let's go back to the slides. The third category of situation in which we should consider adopting a limping approach is when we become short-stacked in a situation where there are no significant ICM implications in play. In other words, if we get short-stacked early on in a tournament. We'll discuss the impact of ICM in a moment, but for now, just take a look at these chip EV short-stack solutions from the solution library. So this right here is our first limping sim. As you can see, it's a chip EV spot where we're 8-handed, 25 big blind stacks, and we're in the cutoff. Now, the cutoff is allowed a limping option here and a 2.1x raise. And you can see that the raise is heavily prevalent, but the limping does start to occur just a little bit. It's only about 2% frequency, but it's not completely insignificant there. And if we were to look at the same spot, but look at the button, it's going to go up slightly. We've got about a 10% limping frequency here, right? And that's not a huge frequency, but it is pretty significant just in terms of what it means for our overall approach, because it's going to alter the types of hands that are in our raising range. And of course, we're too shallow to really have much of a shoving range since we're 25 bigs deep. So the limp is actually going to form part of the strategy here in a pretty significant way. If we were to scale down the stacks, we can go from 25 to, let's say, 17 big blinds. Now we can see every player from the low jack onwards has the option to limp in the sim here. And as you can see, even though the low jack does have some jams here, they also have a pretty significant chunk of limps, about 5% frequency. And again, it's a pretty mixed range. There's some hands that are favoring limp, such as the ace-3 suited, the ace-9 suited, ace-king suited, a couple of other hands, maybe pocket fives, that type of stuff. But it, again, is a very mixed limping range here, and there's not a lot of jamming. It's really just kind of splitting between min raises and limps. So we can see the limping strategy is becoming pretty prevalent, even at 17 bigs from the low jack. Then, if we move on to looking at, say, 10 bigs, this might surprise you. The early position players have the option to limp here, and in fact, they're actually doing kind of what we saw the small blind doing in the heads-up spot once we got really shallow. They're splitting between limps and jams, but they're not doing any min raising. A lot of players will force themselves to play push-fold here with 10 bigs under the gun, and that's not necessarily a huge error, but it is meaningful here that a lot of our strongest hands like aces, kings, and queens, are actually favoring limping because that's the best way for them to get some value here. When they jam, they don't really get called that much considering how much blocking power they have. So in fact, limping and allowing ourselves to potentially get jammed on is actually our best route to getting max value with these hands. And of course, that also allows us to limp with some hands at some frequency that are not just snap calling it off. Ace-6 suited, we've got some little shreds of suited kings and queens. We've got some bits and pieces of king jack, queen jack offsuit, ace nine off, and even some low pocket pairs here as well. So we do have a fairly diverse range here, even though it's only a 4.4% frequency. But when we look at the entire deck, 4.4% is 60 combos of hands. So that's a reasonable frequency of limps here. That's quite a lot of hands that we have to be aware of that might be favoring a limp in this spot. If we go even shallower, when we start to get down to 7 big blinds, you can see that the sims no longer have the limping option here. So we can't really explore it at that depth. And at 8 big blinds, we do have the limping option, but we're not really choosing it. So 8 big blinds is kind of a little bit too shallow to really put any chips into the pot without just jamming. We no longer really have any kind of post-flop equity realization edge. But on the button, we still actually do have a couple of limps. We still do have the traps at 8 big blinds on the button with aces and kings. And again, we do have a few suited hands, a few hands that are just limp folding in this scenario. So even down to 8 big blinds, we do have some open limps here, and it is going to have a slightly higher EV than a pure push-fold strategy. So very interesting to kind of scan through the library here and just see where we're at with these chip EV limping scenarios when there's no ICM in play and we do get short stacked early on. Obviously, these can be pretty useful to have in mind. Finally, the last situation in which we should make sure to have a limping range is if someone else limps ahead of us in a spot where they shouldn't. This might seem a little counterintuitive. After all, wouldn't we want to aggressively target their limps? Well, yes, we do, but the problem is if we target their limps too aggressively, then we're very vulnerable to 3-bets from the players behind. But if we tighten up too much, then we're simply missing opportunities to profitably put money in the pot against a range which is probably too weak. To illustrate this concept, I conducted an experiment with Hold'em Resources Calculator. I ran a 6-handed chip EV spot with a big blind ante and 30 big blind stacks all around, and forced the player first to act in the low jack to open limp with a range of 28.2% of hands, and prevented them from raising. As you can see, the responses from all 5 opponents involved a lot of limping. More limping than raising, in fact. Obviously, the big blind is going to check most of their hands, and the small blind is getting a very good price to complete, but even the hijack, cutoff, and button have a lot of limps here. There are plenty of hands in these ranges which don't benefit a lot from raising, since they can't make better hands fold or worse hands call, but which have far too much equity to simply fold pre-flop. Most of these hands have a preference for limping behind, while plenty of fairly strong hands also have the incentive to limp for the purpose of protecting against raises from the remaining players. So we've seen a few examples of scenarios where we should consider limping, but what about some spots where we definitely shouldn't? There are for sure going to be a couple of those. Let's take a look. The first category is any spot where we're especially deep stacked, for example 50, 100, or even 200 big blinds. The deeper we get, the less validity limping has as an option in positions outside the small blind, since deeper stacks make it progressively more problematic for us to have a relatively capped pre-flop range in any given spot, while it also becomes more difficult to protect our capped range by trapping with our strongest hands. As you saw earlier, most pre-flop sims will mostly avoid limping altogether once we get beyond 25 big blinds, but even more so at 50 big blinds plus. In the same way that pocket aces will only really start flat calling raises instead of 3-betting once we get down to around 30 big blinds or less, it also really doesn't want to have to limp at deeper stacks, since it becomes very difficult to realize our equity effectively when the SPR is extremely high and the pot is potentially multi-way. And when the top of our range doesn't want to limp, that generally is going to influence the rest of our range to want to avoid it as well. Finally, probably the most important circumstance in which we should avoid limping strategies is whenever ICM is starting to become a more prevalent factor in our strategy. High ICM spots create an inflated risk premium on all our decisions, and this means we're getting a progressively worse effective price on every chip we invest in the pot passively. I stress passively here because chips we invest in the pot aggressively also force our opponents to obey their risk premium, which slightly increases the value of aggression on our pot. In essence, what's happening is ICM is increasing the gap between the EV of raising and the EV of calling. This is why many pre-flop strategies in ICM-heavy spots will avoid flat calling raises at a high frequency, and will default closer to a linear 3-betting range. The call is highly disincentivized by the risk premium, but the 3-bet is slightly more incentivized. The same applies for limping spots, especially when our risk premium is higher than that of the opponents left to act behind us. The only exception to this is when we're in the small blind, and the big blind significantly covers us. In these spots, ICM strategies will often default to limping only with a tighter and more protected range than usual. The reason for this is that our limps will be more vulnerable to being attacked by the big blind. So not only do we have more reason to protect our limping range, but we also benefit more from limping with the top of our range in order to induce action from the big blind. So that's about it for our brief guide to limping strategies in tournaments. I would definitely recommend experimenting with the GTO Wizard trainer if you want to understand these approaches on a deeper level. If you have any questions about the concepts in this or any of our other videos, please feel free to reach out to myself or our other coaches and content creators via our Discord server, where there's a large community of active GTO Wizard users engaged in all kinds of discussions. I'll be back soon with another video. Until then, thanks for watching and good luck everyone.